Sure. Hi, everybody. It's really exciting to be engaged with RISD on this event and many others over the years. I am one of the few people I know in the art world who has an archaeology degree. It's not really the most traditional path, but if you can imagine as a third grader getting really excited about, why there was something artistic or visual or mark making about utilitarian objects, that's sort of how I made my way towards contemporary art. I was through a very academic lens for a long time, and so got an archaeology degree in undergrad, and then I also pursued a master's in museum studies, and that was at GW in Washington, D.C. So a little bit of an atypical route. And then I moved to New York in 2001 and began a very decided interest in, pursuing a contemporary art gallery role. I had done so when I was in Washington, D.C. I worked all day full time at a gallery space, doing checklists, cleaning the floor, helping install, helping with PDFs. And then in the evening was in school full time. And so when I moved to New York, it was a big challenge because the perspective on visual art here is very different than it is in Washington, D.C. But I landed a gallery role at a gallery that's no longer open, but it was called Gorney, Bravin and Lee. It was in Chelsea. I worked there for a couple of years. Then I worked for Bob Minuchin, who some of you all might know because of his son. He has a gallery space on the Upper East Side. And then very quickly went back to Chelsea because the Upper East Side was not the level of access of gallery that I was interested in. It was 2 rounds of buzzers just to get in the door. It was Robert, who's very lovely, but it was his old house. I was more of a Chelsea gal with the strolling around on a Saturday free for someone who, may have discovered the High Line. And so went back to Chelsea and became a artist liaison and later a salesperson at Loring Augustine. There I worked with artists like Ragnar Kjartansson, an Icelandic performance artist, Glenn Ligon, Janet Cardiff, and George Burris Miller. It was a really amazing wide range. My interest there, though, became a little bit less about the collector base and became more focused on the legacy of the artist through institutional conversations, acquisitions, exhibitions. So I left that role and I presented an idea to Marianne Boesky to be the director of museum engagement, pretty much focusing exclusively on that. And that's what I did until a month before the pandemic when I started my own business. So that was February of 2020. And KB Art Strategies essentially does art strategy for individual artists, galleries, institutions, really forging directed conversations between those different groups. And I'm based in Brooklyn.
Great. Kristen, thank you so much. Great intro. And Anina. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah. Now, how many years we've been using Zoom now? Hi, everyone. Good evening. And as Kevin said, I'm a recent graduate of RISD. I guess I can still say recent if it's 2017.
Yes.
I think, my story is a little unique in the sense that I had another career and profession before this, and then I treated myself to an MFA degree at RISD. And since then, I have been on a residency tour that lasted right up until the pandemic, where I got to meet and work with a lot of artists and different positions within the field. And that's just led to a very busy showing schedule, taking me right into 2025. Wow. So I've had nonstop gallery and institutional shows. And as someone who works primarily with ceramics, sculpture, and doing installation, I feel like I've become a wizard or master of logistics of sorts, because it has become more about that some days than it is about actually making the work. And that's been globally across the US. I'm also from the Bahamas, so it's important to me to have a presence there as well with my work. So I've been showing kind of everywhere and US, Europe, and the Caribbean, and looking for opportunities that may not present themselves as I thought they may have, but you know, being flexible and agile to get the work out there, because I truly do believe in the work. And I guess a little bit about my work is really trying to find kindred connections across the African diaspora, and highlighting those through the act of making, specifically how craft has played a role in that, and using that as a kind of language and vernacular for the entry point. And yeah, all in the hopes to counteract like cultural erasure and building legacy for a group of individuals that over time have not been able to do that. So it's really about, giving agency and authorship to those who participate in a lot of the historical stories that have been written.
Great. Anina, thank you so much.
Thanks.
And for our third panelist, Storm.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I guess I'll start off by saying I was originally from Los Angeles, and then I moved to New York to do visual and critical studies at the School of Visual Arts. And while I was there, I wrote my thesis on how galleries add to gentrification. So I was really interested in urban development and how artists are involved with their neighborhoods. And how they get priced out of those neighborhoods and aren't able to benefit from the work that they've put in and how they've beautified the city, and then they're priced out and have to leave. Mm-hmm. So that's really how Superposition came about. And I originally was curating at SVA a lot. I went back after I graduated in 2018 and did a few shows with them there. And then I decided that I wanted to do it full time, but not in a permanent gallery space. And so while I was doing these pop-ups, I was also interning at other galleries and trying to soak up all this information of how to really carry this out, but not follow the track of becoming a director of someone above me. So then once I finally decided, okay, I'm really doing this, I applied to the master's program at Sotheby's Institute. And that was through the Claremont Graduate University. It no longer exists now, actually, but I graduated in 2020 on Zoom during the pandemic. And so while that was happening, I was also about a year and a half into having done a few shows with Superposition. And Superposition is basically titled that because I was thinking about the idea of being everywhere and nowhere. And this idea of straddling multiple identities, but also multiple practices. And the goal has been since its inception to travel the whole world, but the pandemic really halted that. So now I've finally been able to exhibit in other places outside of the US. So we just got back from Morocco last month. Wow. And now we're looking at other places like Botswana and Lagos and Accra. So yeah, it's been really exciting. And thanks for having me.
Well, Storm, that actually leads immediately to a question I have, which is taking that position of Superposition Gallery. How do you, it's already a lot to coordinate shows and representation within an established gallery space. How do you do both the shows and the artist and have to secure a space for the work to be shown each time?
Yeah, there's a lot of communication back and forth every single day. I finally have a full-time assistant, which is crazy because I've been searching for so long for somebody that is crazy enough to do this with me, to be honest. But yeah, in the beginning, it was really difficult, like, because I wanted to stick with the mission and everybody's always like, okay, so when are you going to just open the permanent space? I'm like, the whole point is that we're not doing that, guys, So now that I'm a little bit more seasoned and we're going to have our 5-year anniversary this summer, like, people have started inviting us to their space, and other galleries that have like read about it. They're like, oh, like, we could share space for a month, So awesome. In the beginning, I was like going to storefronts and like asking like realtors, and it was a little sketchy, not sketchy, but just like hard. And right. Yeah, so now it's better and we're being invited places, which is really nice.
Fabulous. Great. So I want to remind those attending tonight, do submit questions in the Q&A. And again, I'll begin and continue with questions, but we want to address your questions throughout the evening. I'm going to begin with the classic question, starting with Storm and Kristen. What do you look for in artists? Is it something that you haven't seen before? Are there themes and topics that you yourself are especially interested in connecting with the artists? And either of you can.
I'll go first. She just talked. I'll give her a break. Yeah, so I mean, it's a really unique position to have been a director at a gallery, because there's a bit of an assumption that there's a lot of discussion amongst the staff about the programming, and sometimes that might be the case, and sometimes it really might not. I think it's really fascinating to share with younger artists about how very, very often it's actually artists already part of the program or artists in dialogue with the gallery that they are the ones that share who they're excited about. It could be a peer who was, a fellow student at a certain time. It could be that they become educators and they, see, could be younger, could be older, but could be an artist that they're really excited to bring to the fore. And it might not be for full representation. It might be for a project space. It might be for something, that has a little bit more of a casual framework to it. But it's pretty much, my experience is, number one is gallery artist or artists. Two would be if there are certain collectors that are really like consistent patrons of the gallery, they might say, oh my gosh, I was just in Dallas, or hey, I was up at Bennington and I went through and let me tell you, the open studios. It can often be curatorially as well. Again, if there's an existing relationship with that gallery, perhaps certain artists in the program might be in a group show that's, spearheaded by a particular curator, and they're like, oh my gosh, there's a name that you might not know. Mm-hmm. But I think for me, it is often less about the what someone else might perceive as development, and a lot of it is just literally like a direct conversation. Unfortunately, and this is something that I deal with my artist clients a lot, the way in which people are experiencing information about your work, it does sadly require you to also be very verbally articulate about the work, not just visually. And I hate that that's true. It just is, right? I would love for it to just be slideshow after slideshow, but I still need to know the themes of your work. I think a lot about how, whether it's a website, I'm 44, so I'm kind of right in the middle of caring about Instagram and hating it. Most gallery owners that I know are a bit older than me, right? So they're like really not on it in a way that people might assume. Mm-hmm. But I do want to get a real sense of like, correct me if I'm wrong about the themes I'm assuming based on these visuals. This is a real opportunity for you to harness the dialogue around the work. If people do have websites, which is, again, something I work on often, to me, that's a huge opportunity for you to be the authority on your work. If someone is misunderstanding a theme or they're going in a direction that you feel like is not really indicative of your practice, tell us, fix it, redirect, share who's inspiring you or what it's connected to. So I do think it's really important for people to be able to harness that information and share it. It doesn't necessarily need to be concisely, but it does need to be where the written articulation matches the visual, and I am seeing them kind of engage with each other and they're reflecting each other enough for me to say, oh my gosh, I just went through 5 pages of that person's website and it was really additive and it really started to tell a bit of a story. So that's usually what I am looking for. But I will also fully admit, I don't tend to seek out artists like on the computer. I seek them out in real life. That is my preference. So, that certainly comes with like slightly different parameters than just, sharing websites or sending emails.
But if I could add to that too, Kristen, like as you said, with all networks, person knows someone and there's trust, right? Like, oh, I love their work, we represent them, they just recommended someone else. Those systems, though, can also be circular, right? That the same kind of
Absolutely.
artists,
Yeah.
get represented, and then others that don't have access to the networks or the systems don't get their work shown.
Absolutely. Mhm.
And, I guess I wonder at times when galleries, understand that and know that they need to move beyond that network, if they want to show work that is, breaking those molds.
Sure. I think it also, again, my background's very academic. I'm a museum person, so
Mhm.
I'm a little bit of, like the aberration in the puzzle pieces, to be honest. And I know that's been true, day one. But the gallery is there as a transactional agent for the artist. And so most of the time, they are going to pick what is sadly like a pretty traditional, already known model for them. There are certainly opportunities for that to be challenged. And, when you are on staff, you are trying and trying and trying to push against that. And that can be really difficult. And I'm sure everyone on this Zoom call has seen the last 3 years of some people pushing successfully and some people pushing in a way that, look over here, but quietly they're doing the same thing, if not kind of worse than they were doing before 2020. That has been my experience, unfortunately. And this is not to say it's all negative, but it is to just share the reality of what it's like inside those staff meetings, and, and what people are seeing and what they're feeling might be a little bit different than what's actually happening, where some of those decisions are being made.
Right.
It has been really challenging trying to get any gallery owner, doesn't matter where I worked, where I will work in the future, to look for work made by someone that is different than themselves. That is just super difficult. And we are, I think a lot of people are trying a lot of different ways to do that. I'm excited to be part of a generation that really wants to sort of blow up that system. There are a lot of really great leaders finally coming into some very visible spaces in order to do that, which is really exciting. But it is one of the most traditional, handshake, you might not have a contract kind of discussion.
Right.
So one thing I really care about a lot with artists is making sure they're protected, whether it's doing the logistics for ceramic works being shipped around the world, or, going into a new space that maybe hasn't had artwork exhibited or insured in that space before. So, both of these colleagues on this call, I'm sure, experience a lot of that too. And that can be a really, really big challenge to kind of force that progress and move the needle even just slightly. It takes a lot of work.
No, thank you, Kristen. And Nina, you described your work so beautifully, but also I think indicated part of this question, right? Which is, how can you get your work into galleries, into spaces, into institutions that, may not have shown work that represents the things that matter to you.
Right.
So how have you gone about, like, just as Kristen said, it's hard to change people.
Yeah, it is.
How have
Yeah.
you changed? How have you made that happen?
I just want to say I totally agree with everything that Christian said. And like you kind of like learn these things as you strengthen your craft. Like I think about all of the things that you mentioned as a part of my practice. It's not just making work. But to speak to what Kevin just asked me, there's one thing that I think is really important that's coming very evident as I work on more shows is you really need to have a common understanding with who you're working with and a level of trust. And when you really look into what is required in order to have those things, unfortunately, sometimes you come up against what we call the barriers, which is I can't relate, or this doesn't look like me, or there's no entry point. And how do I trust that
Right.
as something I should move forward with? And that can be really difficult if you're making work that kind of challenges
Right.
our own perceptions of how we navigate the world and our positions in it. So I find that the best working relationships have been, for me, has been the ones where I'm able to articulate what it is I want from the experience and come to a common ground on how that can be mutually beneficial. And sometimes that's not as simple as a consignment agreement, right? Sometimes that's really like a conversation. And not surprisingly anymore to me, but these things take time. You know, individuals ask me like, oh, well, how did you get into that museum show? And I'm just like, dude, I've known that person for like 5 years. I've known them for 5 years. Like, and it took us 2 years to get this project off the ground. I don't think people realize when working with, I don't think it's openly discussed that when you're working with institutions, it tends to be a longer timeline that you may have anticipated. And it's really constantly negotiating, right? And that's where you have to be agile. And so personal philosophy is sticking to, at the end of the day, I need to share the work. And how I do that, a million different ways, right? And the support I need to do it varies on who I'm engaging with in order to make that happen. And I'm constantly trying to find a way to make it happen. So I kind of don't give up, but it's a lot of exercising the brain and brainstorming, problem solving. And sometimes you have to bring in other parties. It's not always like a clean shot. Like just because you got a museum show, but you have this great idea for it doesn't mean that the museum has it in their budget to do it. So then what? How do we engage in other ways? So it's constantly negotiating, I think. And I also think it's talking to people that you have a working relationship with. I think one of the best advice I got probably out of grad school within a few weeks was to not necessarily focus on where a person is positioned, like who they work for or like something like that, or what gallery they're with, but more so the people. And looking for the connections with the actual person and whether you can work with that person or align or have the same interests. Because at the end of the day, within this field, we're constantly having to like be agile, and we often move on. A lot of people start off working one place and then they end up working another place. Does that mean you're no longer talking to them and they're no longer in your network? No. So being agile and constantly thinking through ways to make something happen has been the best thing that's worked for me, and looking for those real connections with individuals within the field who have shared interest.
Right. And of course, Anina, and we all know when we were students in school, the feeling is, oh, I want this to happen, you know, and feeling like, oh, it could be 5 years is like the last thing you want to hear.
I know.
But that time, the relationship building, the timing, all the factors we've been talking about are part of it, which it goes back to being in it for the long term as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think about it like, you just wouldn't invite a stranger into your home. And when we start to think about these relationships, they're really serious, long-lasting relationship. Most individuals are getting into this kind of ecosystem and they work together for a couple of years if it's a good relationship. So the investment, the time, the money, the energy, I think you don't just give that away. I mean, I'm not personally giving that away. I work really hard on my work. So I want to make sure that when I have a piece that's about to leave my studio that I may never see again, that it will be protected, won't be destroyed, be insured, and that I could trust that who it's going to will care for it the same way in which I invested my time and resources into it. So I kind of think about it that way, and I like to have that kind of mutual respect on the other end.
Right. Fabulous. And Storm, your thoughts in this series of questions and responses?
Yeah, I was just agreeing with everyone the whole time. But yeah, I guess some perspective I could give in terms of, well, first I want to go back to the just looking for artists or how we're finding artists. For me personally, because I was in art school myself, it started out as just my peers. So at first it was like who I'm growing with. But now that we've been around a bit more, it's a mixture of who knows who, but Instagram, and then random portfolios from people that I've never heard of, and they don't know anyone in my orbit, which that's honestly my favorite type of outreach. And I don't know, I think a lot of galleries have different perspectives on that, of like just cold emailing someone, but I love getting those. So, but I think that's because I am very embedded in social media. So it doesn't really, I'm not like, who is that? Why, like, who do they think they are? I'm just like, oh, great. Like, props for just trying that, you know? And then in regards to institutions, like, I have been dealing with trying to figure out how to place work, even though we don't have a permanent space, and creating relationships with museum curators, because I'm also an independent curator. So I like kind of weaving in those relationships to my gallery practice. And I feel like that is also a huge point of trust. Like, that has been a huge part of why the gallery has seen success even just in the last year, was because I was embedded in a community for a long time and was just surrounded with the neighborhood. It wasn't even about just the museum itself, but just seeing these people every day. So yeah, I kind of like trailed off there, but yeah, I agree with both of y'all.
Yeah, thank you, Storm. So we do already have 4 questions, and it's really important. I want to address the questions as we go along. It will mean we'll be jumping around a bit, maybe not as sequential, but hey, that's a creative path, not a linear one. So this first question is a mix. The person, thank you very much for all for sharing. Jumping right to it, would you be open to studio visits, and how do you schedule that with you? So in a way, not only with you, but it's a great question where someone is approaching you, they get contact, and then now they're like, would you be open to a studio visit? How do you approach that? And maybe Chris, or go Storm. Yeah.
Was the question about having a studio visit, like an artist reaching out to the gallery?
Yeah, so I think the person's asking in part for, each of you, could they schedule a studio visit, but also it is indicative of that core question is, I've made contact with you, can I schedule a studio visit with you? How open are you to that with artists who approach you? At what phase does that happen? And then what do you get from it when you do it?
Yeah, for me personally, I've started with Zoom meetings first, and then we meet in person just to like get a vibe, because safety is important to me. That's one aspect, just as a Black woman in the art world. But I think, like, if a Zoom doesn't go past that, it's not necessarily just because I didn't like talking to them or whatever. It's just, oh, like, things may not line up. So another aspect is, if I'm just in the area and there's a studio of a bunch of artists in the same building, like, I'd love to just hop around, and that's like a really organic way of doing that. And some artists that I work with now that I've been working with for 3 years have happened that way, where I just like stumble upon a studio that they didn't even reach out to me. But yeah, when I said like the cold email, I'm totally open to those. So Zoom first, and then if I'm in New York or any of those cities at that time, like, I'm always posting where I am, so that if somebody does want me to actually come, then they know that I'm there.
Yeah. And Kristen?
Yeah, so one thing that I am always really explicit about is I don't have a gallery. Like, these are people I know. I'm surrounded by my own visual history, but dang, I'm a horrific artist. If nobody wants me making anything, like, I'll swap for other things. But yeah, it's really very interesting, again, being part of a dynamic where you're representing and you're showing, new work every 6 weeks, and your office changes every 3 days, and that's super, super intense. But I don't actually have a space. I am the same age as Rachel Uffner. And I remember when she started her gallery and I was like, well, good luck to you. Like, that's just, that's never been my main interest. Again, I think because of this, this really strong interest in the institutional conversations. To Anina's point, I worked on a sale to a very lauded institution, and it took us 6.5 years. And I didn't even work at the gallery anymore. And the curator called me to congratulate me, and I didn't know what she was talking about. And it was finally made its way through the committees. So it is unsexy. It is patience. It is long-term cultivation. It's dragged out. It's all that stuff. But it's also really important, as we were talking about sort of changing the larger narrative. I live 20 blocks from the Brooklyn Museum. It's one of the few institutions in New York City that actually like engages with the community where it is. And I care a lot about that. So when they acquire a work by Sanford Biggers, I'm like, that feels great.
Yeah.
I care so much that that's an option. So the reason I bring that up is because when someone wants a studio visit, I just want to always be really clear, like, I'm here to chat with you about how to develop community. It's called Art Strategies for a reason. It's not called KB Art Gallery, because I just don't want people to misunderstand what the opportunity of connecting with me will look like. I definitely am a pretty straight shooter. I'm gonna dial down into again, it's not going to be coming from someone that has a studio art background where they know the material. That is not my forte. But I might ask about how you're photographing the work or how you're presenting the work. When I've done workshops in the past for students, I actually talk about like, what do you do for your studio, depending on what type of person is coming. And they're it's very literal. It's like, here's what curators do. Here's what some of them might be like. Here's what a gallery owner does all day. If they're only with you for 40 minutes and they're on their phone, did it take them an hour and a half to get to and from your studio? Mm-hmm. Have they devoted over 2 hours of their day to engaging with you? That might be true. It also might be rude that they're on their phone a lot, but maybe the plumbing in the gallery isn't going great, or somebody's payroll didn't get processed or something. I tend to do a lot around, giving actionable advice. Like, I love drawings. I want to see something that's in process. I don't want to see everything in a pristine white environment with the wall just perfect. And I know how to cut and paste that visual into a gallery space. Like that's boring. I don't want that. I would love to see, let's say Anina does a studio visit with me and something's halfway done. And then 2 months later, she says, hey, I finished that piece. Here's how it turned out. That is freaking exciting. These are not my skill sets. So to be able to see how she's going to solve a problem, It is not going to be the way I think might be intuitive to me, because her skill set is so far and advanced. So I think making sure that when you're doing a visit, it might not be about like presenting a complete body of work or showing something in this sort of final stage. It feels very vulnerable to do that, to show someone something that doesn't feel totally resolved. But I promise you that every single thing I live with, every artist I'm excited about, if it's resolved, I don't need to come back to it. I go, thanks so much, saw it, and nothing happens to me. My intellect isn't stirred. My body doesn't have a reaction. When I like something, I do this with my hands and I don't even realize it. If none of that happens, it's resolved and I haven't actually connected with it. So just don't be afraid to show things that are in process, because I promise you, people, I always say that it's like going into someone's like therapy session, going into someone's studio. It's so personal. I ask where can I put my bag? Not because I care if it's dirty, but because I know that the surfaces are used for different things and some things are very intimate. Not everyone's going to come in that way. But I think it's really important to extend that, because I think most people, when they see that gesture, whether artistic or personal or whatever, they often will respond in kind. And that's when the beginning of that 5-year relationship that she mentioned can actually start. It's not going to be this sort of glossy, pristine experience. It's going to be I'm working this out. I'm not so sure how to deal with this issue. So that's usually my suggestion when it comes to studio visits, is to kind of like lean into the mess a little more.
Some really cool, great points. And Anina, have you approached people to get that studio visit, and how did that go? And any tips and advice on that?
Oh, I guess it's the Capricorn in me. Okay, let me be really honest. I am not the type to ask for a studio visit or cold call. I'm like the complete opposite of that. However, I do studio visits, but I'm with, I'm of the school of, why do I want a studio visit? And I think that what's the common narrative is, you get a studio visit, you have a show. And that has not been in my experience. I mean, yes, I've had studio visits that have eventually led to shows, but ultimately, before they get into my studio, we have interacted in some other way that wasn't an email or a phone call. And so I have had instances where it's been kind of cold called, but again, those have also been followed up with like a phone call, a quick chat on Zoom, or even just meeting somewhere else. I think the studio is a very private space. I am also of the mindset of, but like, as a Black woman, you don't just invite anybody to your studio. It's a safety thing for me as well, that I'm very serious about. And I encourage everyone to be serious about it. So yeah, I kind of don't do that. But when I do a studio visit though, I usually have like point to it. Like, like we're having a studio visit because we want to show you the latest work or something that I've been thinking through or something I'm preparing for. I usually have a kind of agenda of sorts, not formally, but in my head. Like, I really wanted this person to be in my studio so we could talk about the latest work that's out right now or something, but it's never just to like come wander around. Right. That to me feels really uncomfortable. When I've done residencies, studio visits was a big part of meeting people and meeting other artists. So I would be like, hey, let's hang out in my studio, so I could get to know other artists really well. And I think artists advocate for artists the best experience. So if anybody's gonna get a cold call from me for a studio visit, it'll be another artist before it's like a gallery. And then if, and regardless of who's coming in the studio, like I said, I try to just have like it be a purposeful visit and not just like very abstract, and that we're kind of like all on the same page. I do open studios with Elizabeth Foundation because I'm of the arts, because I'm a part of them. And that is a once a year thing, I think, in October. And that to me is good. But I also find those kind of experiences a little exhausting because it's like a constant group of people coming in. And to me, that's not really a studio visit. A studio visit is a real like intimate interaction with a small group of individuals, if it's more than one person, and we're really like talking about the work. So open studios, different story, but studio visits to me are really intimate and kind of purposeful for that time period.
Great. Anina, thank you. There's a second part to the first question, but I'm going to move on to some others and come back to that because I want to ask the questions from other individuals as well. This one's loaded. This one's huge. Okay, ready? How do you support your life as an artist financially? And I think the core of that is what we've been talking about this evening, that a lot of this is long-term. Things don't happen on schedule. Other things in life happen on schedule. Rent is due, food, you need to buy food, you have to pay your student loan. So what are some of your, I think part of it is, are some of your suggestions that allow artists to take the longer road, but how do they aggregate and support themselves financially in doing so? And I have some input on that as well from the career side, but Let me turn to each of you and gain your perspectives. Storm, what are some insights you have?
Sure. Well, in the beginning of the gallery, I'll be very frank, I was barely breaking even for the first 2 years. So, like on an investment of a show where I was renting space every time, a different space, also helping with studio expenses for the artists, and then the actual event planning of the receptions, like that was all just out of my pocket from my odd jobs. And then once I would sell the work, it would just go right into the next show. So it's hard. Like it's just really hard. And I'm just now seeing green, like it start to go green. But excuse me, I actually hired an accountant that is specifically for artists and galleries. It's called ArtSmart Inc. So that's just, I don't know, not a financial advisor. I'm not giving like
Right.
broadcasting anything. I'm just saying like I had to look to someone else because that wasn't my expertise.
Right.
And it has helped me be more responsible with my money. Like, okay, like you need a DJ. Okay, maybe look here instead of getting like this DJ. Like even those tiny little things add up so much, and it has helped a lot. And then rent is due always.
Right.
Sometimes it's not paid on time, but the shows will definitely happen.
Right. Right.
Yeah, my 2 cents.
No, but it's often an aggregate, as we know. Kristen?
Well, I'm not a practicing artist, but my first job, I was paid $24,000 a year, and I had a master's degree, and my whole family was like, "Wait, that doesn't include dental or vision?" And I was like, "What and what?" And they're lovely, but you know, they both did the same job for decades. And my dad, my mom like was at the same company for 52 years. So there was we don't have one of me in the family. Everyone's like educators or more like accountants and stuff. So it was a real challenge to like stay the course while there were a lot of family questions. I'll just say that much. But what was really helpful, because I have lived in New York for so long, was that I was friends with people that were coming up as well. It might not have been in the exact same community, but we were all trying to navigate New York at the same time. Again, this was really early 2000s. In my previous RISD visits, I have often told people, Philly is a really great town.
Mm-hmm.
Where I live in Brooklyn, it takes me about an hour to get to Chelsea. If you go to Moynihan Station, that's like an hour and 20 from Philly. And I know Philly's more expensive now than it was,
Right.
even just 2 years ago. But I think there is like a little bit of new opportunity that has happened in the last 3 years. Obviously, there's been horrific devastation and grief and anxieties that are still unfolding. But a few things that I feel like have really helped with the transparency of the art world, whether some art fairs that couldn't happen in person, for a brief moment, they were posting pricing. Now, some of them were nonsense numbers, like between $5 and $10,000. And I was like, well, that's really not helpful.
Right.
But for like a minute, for a very sweet minute, I went on the internet and I called as much of that information as I could get. So, I think being around people who mirror your finances, I've done a lot of salary equity work. So I've also talked a lot about, what does it mean to go into curatorial or institutional work? What does it mean to go into commercial work? I was part of a group called the Professional Organization of Women in the Arts, and you can look at our 2018 salary survey and you can kind of see institutions start higher than galleries, and then around year 5, it kind of ticks in a different direction. But let me tell you, it was not until I was 33 that I made like a living that I felt comfortable and proud of. I didn't have to like ask for money, or, there was no one to ask anyway, but it was definitely challenging because the art world puts on like a very particular facade that makes it seem as if everyone was doing great. I then found out that the person at the gallery next door to me had $50,000 in credit card debt, and that's why she had her Celine purse. So, you kind of got to pop some bubbles. And it's only when you become friends with people do you find out about the debt or that you find out that maybe their family has been taking care of their rent or something. So again, I don't really have any, most of the artists I know that I'm friends with, again, we're kind of within 5-10 years of each other. A lot of them, unfortunately, are quite tied to academia because that provides them with stability.
Right.
And some of that is by choice and some of it is not. I also know a lot of artists who got married because that was financially in their best interest for health insurance and things.
Right.
And so, or spend a lot of their time, applying for grants because their space keeps changing every year. And so there's the transition of moving the things. So I think, I'm a very community oriented person. If you look at my website, it says collaboration 8 billion times. And that's just who I am as a person. But I do feel like the takeaway from this conversation is that there are lots of versions of community. You can be a Capricorn, you can be an extrovert. There are ways to cobble things together now that there were not 3 years ago. Online communities can, I think, provide a very hefty dose of connection. My friend Helen Toomer started a thing called Art Mamas, which is essentially female identifying artists who are parents and discussing the unique challenges of that. Trying to go to a residency while being a parent is pretty much impossible. So the career gets stalled.
Right.
So I think really seeking out a community that fits you. That might be an Instagram community. That might be, showing up at all of Storm's openings. It might be, whatever your thing is. I really think being in community with people to remind yourself that the things you're seeing are one version of the art world, and it's not the best one. It's just the one that's being shown the most.
Right.
So to decide for yourself, how do I deal with the finances, and how do I surround myself with people who, might be able to connect me with resources or be seeking the same resources? I feel like that's hugely important just for your own emotional health and well-being.
Yeah. Fabulous advice. And Anina, living it firsthand. And I do know this is a very personal question. So I do, from all of you, respect, if there are things that aren't comfortable to say, but if you have thoughts on that are comfortable saying, if you want to offer your insights, Anina.
Yeah, I think that Storm and Kristen hit it on the head. I mean, it really is about, well, first, what Storm said is hard. Because I think people think hard means something else. And I think we need to realize that that's the baseline. It's a challenging field to start off in and accept it, move on. So now that we know that it's challenging, what do we do from there? For me, it was, and again, I think finances is such a personal thing.
Right.
I think there's so many ways to go about that. I do think community is so important. Who you talk to, who you're communicating with, what is your support system plays a huge role in navigating that, right? But also breaking down your own relationship with finances. We all have different spending habits that come from our experiences to the point that we are now. And we all have aspirations of how we want to live or have expectations. And sometimes you have to kind of wiggle those around if you're really committed to being in this field. Sometimes you have to wiggle those around. So I think it's a constant negotiation as well. I find myself, my motto is the work is the priority. And everything isn't monetarily beneficial. Some things you receive benefits in different ways. And so I kind of think beyond just the finances. But when it comes to paying the rent, yeah, I mean, I did a residency tour because I was like, who can afford studio and apartment rent right out of grad school? Not me. So, I mean, I did a residency tour, and one of my requirements for my residencies was that I had housing. And if I didn't have housing, then there was some other part of the residency that provided compensation. Maybe I taught a class, at the community center, and that's what helped me to pay rent. But it's always trying to do that kind of gymnastics. And I don't think that ever changes as you move up in the art world, that I'm realizing. Like, some of the people who are like selling their money for big works, they still negotiating and doing gymnastics, like, how many people do I have on staff versus where we're going to move the studio. Like, so I think you're always going to be in a position where you have to figure out how you're going to navigate finances. So knowing your priorities is really important. For me, priority was the work. I always was like, listen, I don't need a home as long as my artwork has a home, right? Like, I'll crash on somebody's couch, but that was a decision I made. And so that's what I mean by like priorities, knowing your priorities, having a community and a support system that you could talk to about that goes a long, long way in navigating, and just constantly applying for things, grants, opportunities, like, they're out there. And be aware of your barriers. I speak to a lot of people and they're like, oh, I only want to do New York City. I love the example of Philadelphia because I used to live in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is close enough that you can come up to an event, be in New York all the time, and people think you live there.
Right.
So I'm just saying that, like, things in perspective as far as like how you can make it happen for yourself. Because again, there is a facade. And once you realize that, you're like, oh, so I just need to be present. And that's really what it is. You need to be present. You need to have great work. It doesn't matter where you are, like, physically, actually, sometimes.
I just want to add one thing, because one thing that I've noticed that happens around like between year 5 to 8 outside of school is like maybe a classmate or two are starting to get more visibility or accolades or seemingly different, maybe financial strata. Just be aware of how you feel in the presence of that person. Because again, I care a lot about community, but I also know that it can be a little bit of a dangerous comparison game sometimes. So to Anina's point, great, you have 2 galleries, you have 3 galleries. That's three whole staffs asking you for stuff constantly. It's bringing on, maybe someone to work with you in your studio. Maybe you don't enjoy working next to someone in your studio. So you have to like leverage when it's your private time in the studio and when it's admin time.
Right.
So, but just, I've just seen so many times people go, yeah, I felt I was doing great, but then I ran into fill in the blank at this event and gosh, I just like felt terrible. And so I think being open about finances and resources with people who you trust, because it is very personal for sure. But also to recognize that sometimes the people who are kind of putting you in your place that way, like they have the worst situation at everyone. And to just be a little bit aware of, what their your supposed opportunities you're seeing them get are versus what it's actually like to spend time with them. Because I can kind of always tell in my body when somebody is like their egos in the conversation more than the reality. And I, if I were a practicing artist, like I wouldn't really want to be expending my energy that way. So just be aware when you're feeling that drain start to happen, like maybe that's not quite the right person to talk to about comparable living situations or resources that you might want to share. So to just kind of be aware of who to trust with that information, I think is an important thing to just keep note of.
Can I just plug something real quick that was really helpful to me? I don't know if they're still doing it, but Assets for Artists did a lot of workshops on money and finances and taxes specifically to artists, for artists. And I can't remember the other one, but Asset for Artists they had a series of workshops that were really helpful. And I felt that they were universal across wherever you were to navigate.
Yeah, I wanted to mention to those attending and for the video itself when others watch it, when we run our Art of Business series during winter session, it's one that we are dealing with contracts, taxes, marketing oneself, and legal issues. And that is something that we have actually pulled speakers from the artists, the Assets for Artists program and other programs such as Art World Learning and Creative Study. So I think when that program is out, it's always like, oh, that's for the designers at RISD, and not at all. I mean, it's for all of you. And if anything, for the fine artists, it's just as valuable to be taking this in. Another thing that's really important to us, and Assets for Artists does this, the people who are delivering those programs are themselves usually artists or in the art field. So you're getting it, you know, Hannah Cole is one of the best tax experts out there. Everyone I think has heard her in the sense that it's like, oh my goodness, you really exist, an artist who, you know, knows taxes. And she's just great in her delivery. We've had her present so many times. So keep that in mind, because I think to the points said right now about finances and what Anina said, especially, is you've got to also know your own finances and how you feel about money that are going to impact your decisions. I want to add that I've purchased a subscription for RISD with Creative Study. It used to be known as Art World Learning. So if you're a student, you actually have full access free to 19 videos, including the solidarity economy, finance, debt, all of these really important issues. So keep that in mind. That resource is available for you as well and super helpful. Now, I'm going to flip something and ask, cut right to it. What are things that annoy you that artists do that you just are like, I wish you didn't do that in getting exhibition opportunities, approaching me. And again, I know it can be personal and you may not want to say, but it's always good to hear the tips, and it's also good to hear, the positive ones, but also, boy, does that get under my skin kind of thing. So
I'll start because I'm so it's really the same thing, but in two avenues, which is essentially coming to my work when I have an event and maybe I can see the outline of a portfolio in your bag, or I can feel the shark circling me or something. What's great about a public opening is, of course, the show is open to the public. It's celebratory. It's from 6 to 8. Some people in New York, have alcohol. Some people don't, but it's to mill around and maybe see the artist or talk to some of the people who work there, because their job is to sell the art that is on the wall. Right. So even as the museum person, my role was certainly to maintain relationships with my existing collector base, talk to trustees who might go, oh my gosh, I love her work. Let's talk to our curator buddy at the Whitney about doing a studio visit or an acquisition. But it is my job to very kindly and deftly and professionally survey the room and get my job done. Was being paid a salary to work on behalf of the gallery. And certainly for the artist whose show is on the wall, oh my gosh, that's probably 2 to 4 years of that person's work. It is my job to make sure that that's as successful as possible. Yeah. So, and I don't think people do this as much anymore, but, taking the opportunity of a public opening to come and talk to a salesperson about your work is not going to go well. Similarly, that's the same thing as bringing it to an art fair on one of the first days. By the time it's day 3 or 4, like maybe, we've been sitting there, the boss left 3 days ago, you're running on, espresso fumes or something. Talking to somebody about art itself is really exciting if it's kind of more of the general public day when people are just there to kind of like see the spectacle. But for the most part, I don't find the art fair conversation to be a great time either. So I think just being really aware of the fact that whether we like the program or the end goal or the values, the actual role for most galleries is to be the commercial agent for the artist. And so that is pretty much going to be their main concern. It's amazing to have worked for someone who cared enough to have me on staff as a museum liaison. There were 5 of us in all of the United States. Wow. So I know how unique that was, but just be aware when you're engaging with someone of like what their actual job is at that time, you can still do it in a kind way. Hey, I saw you at the Elizabeth Foundation, or hey, I saw you at, the Sharp Willentis Open Studios. Show looks great. Like, would love to connect at another point. Like, I'll find your email on the gallery website or something. Like, it can still be nice, but it can also be acknowledging of what is actually happening at that
Right.
time.
Great advice. Storm.
Yeah, I actually had a portfolio presentation at my last show. So yeah, that was it was interesting, and it was in all of the photos in the background, like the reception. So everybody knows that person now in that way. But yeah, another aspect I would bring up is putting down another artist for your gain, or like, yeah, just yeah, I've had a lot of DMs or emails or in-person conversations where people will be like, really, you chose them? Or, like, it's just, okay, don't offend my perspective if you're trying to work with me, right? So yeah, just don't put people down. That's all.
Always the best advice.
The world is very, very small. You think it's tiny. It's so much
Exactly.
smaller.
Oh, it is so
Yeah.
tiny. It is so tiny.
And Nina, maybe if I flip this again and say, what are some of the irritating things that come from the gallery side or the curator side?
Wow, that's such a loaded question. I want to have a career.
Right.
Kevin, what are you trying to do?
Right.
I don't know. Know how to answer that question.
No,
To be
and don't
honest.
worry.
I really don't know how to answer that question because the people that I work with,
Right.
I think we have an understanding of how we're working. Like, I think that was set up in our dynamic of our relationship prior to, like, people, I don't know how people think it happens, but it's, I can get reached out to by a gallery, but the first conversation isn't necessarily, let's do a solo show.
Right.
Like, the first conversation is actually getting to know you and about your work. In fact, I would be hesitant if someone called me and was like, I want you to have a solo show. Then I'd be like, you don't really, like, hold on.
Yeah.
Like, I actually like the smooth, the softer intro where it's like, let's talk about my work. Maybe ask me what my goals are. What is my exhibition schedule? Because you asked for a solo show. You don't even know if I can do that.
Right.
So
which is
I
funny,
found,
because that's almost the opposite. Like, and I could totally understand it, but so many people are like, oh my God, I got a solo show, and it's the understanding of this relationship building again. Like, well, you didn't ask me anything else. You're just telling me that,
I kind of have the side eye if you just come out of nowhere and like, I don't know anything about you. And you're, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I think it's just such a big investment, and I think about that all the time as a person who's done this now. It's like, do you know what it takes for me to put on a solo show? The resources that I have to invest prior to you getting this work. And I think gallerists and museums understand that. That's why sometimes things take longer than you think they will, because it is really an investment of time and resources. So yeah, I mean, and I've just never had that experience before. Not to say that like it can't happen, but usually it's clear between you and the person who's like asking you for the solo show that you guys have a mutual understanding already, right? Like, even if it's someone I haven't conversed with and they're like, hey, let's have a meeting. I'd love to talk to you about your work. And they probably already know they're going to ask for a solo show, but it's not the first question out the gate. It's usually like, let's talk about the work. And then, you do your research. Like, I mean, if somebody reaches out to me and I don't know who they are, I usually look them up
Right.
before I respond. Like, it's a given for me. That's why we have Google. So I look them up. I see if anybody I know knows them, and then I respond, accordingly. And usually by the time we have a meeting, I kind of know where it's going. The person introduced themselves. And I had the opportunity to, do some research on who they were, because they did research on you before they emailed you. Trust. So it's not like you're doing some like underhanded thing. You're just being aware and knowledgeable about the circumstance. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think I've really run into like anything that I could say that's kind of stressful, especially if you're honest about your positioning. I think sometimes as artists, you're afraid to say, well, I can't afford something, or afraid to say that you can't do something. And I think that they say, oh, we want to do a solo show with you in June. And you're like, there's no way I can do it in June, but being honest about where you are, I think has always worked out for me, where I think I'm not surprised. But stressing, like, if I want to work with a person, like, listen, I know you wanted to do June. That really doesn't work for me because I have X, Y, and Z, but maybe we could do July.
Right.
Or maybe we could do an earlier month. But I'm always like open to discussing through this option. So again, I haven't really had any instances I could think off the top of my head where I've been like, oh, if you're a gallery, please don't do that. Or if you're an institution, please don't do that. I think they're usually very mindful, well, at least ones that are worth a grain of salt, right? Like, that are worth something. They're really mindful of the position and who they're asking and so forth.
If I can just add, I would just like to add, like, developing professional trust is very different than becoming friends with your dealer. Or like you kept talking about, like, an alignment of expectations. It's a business relationship.
Yeah.
It's great to like them and you want your values to be the same, but there should be, the friendship should not come at a cost of not having a contract or feeling like you as an artist can't do exactly what Anina just very professionally said. I'm super excited. I'm really enthusiastic about this opportunity. Just timeline wise, I got to push it back to September, but like, let's get a date on the calendar. Like, there's so many ways of doing that. I feel like artists have been trained out of understanding that they're the ones that have the leverage in that conversation, in most conversations in a way. And what ends up happening is that the feeling of that power gets diminished, where the friendship or an aspiration of friendship kind of wants to replace it. And that's where I've seen things just blow up in crazy, terrible ways on either side.
Right.
Because the conversations about what is the goal for the gallery relationship or the curatorial relationship or the project at the roving space or whatever, what are we trying to accomplish with that? And as long as everybody knows what that is, if you want to go get a margarita, great. But like, it should not come at a cost of being able to say, I need to move my show dates.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. These questions, I think everyone recognizes each one has expanded to encompass 5 other topics. So we've covered a tremendous amount of territory. The time has flown by, but I want to get to these final 2 questions that were addressed, and then maybe one more, and then we'll wrap it up because again, the time has really gone fast. But this of the remaining 2 questions here, do you think that moving abroad after graduating is a bad career move? Could it stunt my growth as an illustrator or a painter? And I think that's the feeling. And, I don't want to go into this right away. I want to go do this, but if I go and do that, can I be an artist there? Kind of a classic thing that happens for a lot of people. So just some thoughts and feedback on that.
I say do it. Going abroad was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was like I learned about the art world from like a completely different perspective than this Western lens. So then when I actually came back here, it opened everything up. Like I always encourage people to travel. Of course, we're traveling all the time. And I don't think it would be a bad career move because you're going to make more connections there. And this it's a global art world. It's not just New York or LA or wherever. It's global, and it's getting more and more global now that the pandemic has loosened restrictions too. It's and stunt your career growth as an illustrator. No, not at all. I think go 100%.
I imagine that's the universal, you all said the same
Yeah.
thing. So,
I do want to add one point though, with a question like that. And of course, on the surface, I'm going to say, yes, get on the plane, whatever, like expand your perspective, because that's what lends to being a great artist, being able to have these perspectives. But I will say that a question like that to me is very vague. And I caution against these kind of questions when people ask them of me, because I'm like, well, what do you want for your career? Who am I to say whether going abroad is that? Because I don't really know what career you're going for. You haven't articulated that to me at all. You know what I mean? So like on the surface, that's because I want to be a global artist. So that makes sense to my alignment with what I want for my career. However, if you don't want that, I don't know if that's a good move for you. So the question, when I see questions like this, because I get them all the time about a decision, is does that align with the goals you have for yourself as an artist? Because no one can define what you want for your career. That's up to you. And if this is helping you get there, then yes. If it's not, I don't know. Just wanted to put that out there about that, those kind of questions.
Perfectly said, Anina, for sure.
It's also a matter of what does it mean to you to build a new community elsewhere. So I'm assuming that this person might be a bit younger, and so maybe establishing new ties somewhere else is, an earlier life plot point. I know many artists that have left New York for a host of reasons, that have left major cities, and they have had a hard time not in the studio, but actually in dialogue with community. There isn't an intellectual discussion around visual art. There might not be environments where they can come together and have the kinds of conversations they might be used to at RISD or elsewhere. And that creates a certain amount of loneliness that, you can go in the studio every day, but if you don't feel connected to where that work is situated in the world, that can definitely be a challenge. I think we all want to say, like, of course, like, new opportunities and new inspiration, like, will add to your work. That's all true as well. But I have certainly watched people who go from a relatively extreme or intense environment where the community that they're used to and the types of conversations that they've become accustomed to don't exist in the new place that they're going to. And so just trying to, again, either keep the strands to that previous group in some really active and tangible way, or how do you create a similar, or seek out or create for yourself a similar set of values for this new location that you're considering?
Yeah, and I think a common thread through this entire evening has been about community, finding your community, finding your support group, peer group. And I have seen for so many years, people come back, oh my God, this conversation was so great. I haven't had one like this. And, since I left RISD, or, I thought this was the place for me and it wasn't. And that, to the points made by Anina and Kristen, really fits that. You got to understand what you want from it. At the same time, the surface of it is you're graduating, see the world, experience it, absorb the world. And if that's what you want, you're going to get so much out of it too, which is exactly said by Storm and by all of us as well, because we all reacted first like, go, that was the first reaction. So last one here, and then again, one final, and then we'll wrap it up. As a figurative artist, I fear that my work won't be taken seriously in contemporary galleries. Do you have any insight on this?
This is another vague one, I think.
Yeah, totally. Listen, do you take your work seriously?
Right, that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
Because people really do, finding that people really do take it where I take it. If I come in unsure, they're unsure. If I'm sure and I'm serious, they're sure and they're serious. And then do the research. Like, I think all of us have done, we'll do the research. If you're doing figurative work, what are the type of galleries that show figurative work? Research, like, look into it. That's been like the crust. I mean, Kevin knows this about me. I'll research till I can't research anymore.
Right.
And there's no such thing as that. So
Right.
go down the rabbit hole, find the contemporary art galleries that are supporting figurative artists. That's kind of my advice on that question.
Yeah, because I think part of this comes from what was said before. There is the facade of the art world, and on that surface, there is what appears to be trends and things that are selling. And we do know there are movements like, this period, that period, et cetera. But the counterpoint to it, and I've heard this for so long, there's places for almost everyone in every direction, style, concept. But to Anina's point, you got to do the research and you've got to find where they are and then build those relationships we've been talking about all night. So.
Yeah, there's a bit of a false dichotomy that things are either figurative or
Right.
abstract, which is like the most exhausting thing ever. And honestly, it usually comes in the form of what shows are up in Chelsea right now. And that like no one else cares except for this group of however many people, but it's constantly in the press and it's constantly being discussed. And it's like, Black figuration is a thing. And I'm like, that is a made up combination of two things that are not like, it's not like a trend or something. I don't know. It's very exhausting to me to see that, because it makes me so sad that someone would say there are hundreds of galleries in one city, thousands of galleries in the country, and I'm not sure that figuration, which is recognizing a human form, and like that has no place to exist. That makes me incredibly sad. But it's also just not true, and it doesn't even really need to be, oh, this gallery specifically shows figuration. It just needs to be that when you look at a roster, that you don't necessarily, here's the thing that I don't like that artists do sometimes. They go, hey, you work with film? I'm like, my work's just like that person. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't know you. And also like, we have one of them and that's his name. And you just told me we have one. So you could say something, about how you would add to the program, maybe. But I think, maybe there's some sinewy lines that are happening with the abstract artists in a certain program. Maybe it's a sculpture program, but the way in which people engage with those installations very much hearken to the body and its proportions. So it might not be, oh, everyone here has like a person on the roster, but to kind of see what stylistic aspects are you bringing to the table? Does it have a more surrealistic tone? Is it more modernist? Is it blocky? Is it aggressive? Whatever, pick your words. But I think all of those styles can exist concurrently.
Right. So to conclude, I'm actually going to come back up to the first question, but reconfigure it a little bit. On an ending note from each of you, are there online resources, directories, and recommendations on finding galleries, opportunities, grants, and residencies from your perspective? Now, from the career perspective, we've got an amazing array at the career site when you click on artist resources. So I always want to remind people just how much we have at our site. But hearing from each of you, from your perspective, what are some of the valuable recommendations to find exhibition opportunities, art fairs, residencies, and grants?
Oh, I was unmuted the whole time, sorry. I look at Creative Capital and Artist in Rise. Artist in Rise is a residency program listing. Actually, a peer of mine started that from her thesis project at the Sotheby's Institute. So it's actually a new listing that's been going on for about a year now.
Wow.
And they are constantly updating it. But yeah, Creative Capital, NIFA. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Storm.
I would say that Creative Capital as well.
Yeah.
They do a thing. It's a little, sometimes it's like a little on the delayed side, but they do post and say, here's what's happening these 2 months, but sometimes it's like a few days into the month in which they're posting it. So
Mhm.
you go, it's January, February, and they posted on like January 8th. So you may have like missed a thing. So that's my only mini gripe there.
Yeah.
NIFA for sure. Sharon Loudon's website like is literally has like a compendium of resources. So when I'm feeling like particularly lazy, because she's very good at keeping those things updated, I will send someone there.
What site is that again?
Oh, her name is Sharon,
Sharon.
Sharon, and her
Yep.
last name is Loudon, Louden.
Great.
She's just, yeah, she's good at like sort of the amalgam of them. And then I had done like a screenshot. I have done that. I've done workshops for Assets for Artists at Mass MoCA before, and you can't tell people who live in very remote places to just go to the gallery night because they don't have any. So I had compiled, I think it's like 45 different places, which you guys are going to share. But it's things like Fabrication Shop, Arts Council, Music Hall, Dance Space, Science Center, Residency, Artist Run Space, Historic Home, Anthropology Museum, Market, Flower Show, Public Art Commission, Ceramic Center, Glass Studio. Like, not everyone has all the things that you're hoping for to speak to what you're doing, but there are people creating everywhere, and it might not be in the exact dialogue that mimics a RISD experience, but chances are that there might be a furniture maker or a glass blower or something to just consider, and to, we all have our own snobbishness and stuff around some of this, but to really be open and acknowledge that can be fruitful and educational in really important ways that I think also help if you're in the process of making sure you do have access points for your work. That's not just for, the four of us to see and talk about.
This is
Oh yeah, there it is.
just got it. Can you all see it on the screen? Okay, so it'll be part of the video, and so when people watch the video, they can pause in the spot and look at the list. But Kristen, I wanted to ask, I should have asked you earlier, would it be all right if we took this list and incorporated into our website? And
Oh my gosh, yeah, go for
Okay.
it.
Fantastic.
I didn't put like a kbartstrategies.com, watermark across it or anything.
Okay, no, we could.
As you like.
Okay, no, we can definitely add that. Credit
That was a
for-
joke. I swear that was really a joke. It's
Oh,
fine.
no, but we like to credit always. So, Kristen, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
And then Anina, your thoughts on sources?
Yeah, in addition to everything that everyone has said, because I've used all of those, I've gone through like a lot of those. I also keep my own personal database that has been running for years now. I started it when I was in grad school, and I've populated with not just the opportunities that have come along through online resources, but I've also populated it with people I've met that did opportunities. And then I go, oh, you're where? And then I take note of it, do a little research on it. If it's something I want to like participate in, I'll add it to my own list. And I don't really care too much about the deadline for things. I note the deadline. Sometimes I hear about something and it's too late, but I'll note and put on my calendar with a little reminder, like check back at this opportunity. Last year, that was a thing. Is it still being offered the following year? So in addition to, I will do that, or sometimes an artist that I really admire, when I'm looking at their resume and I've seen all the things that they've done, like I was like, oh, you did something in Alaska? What did you do that with? And then it'll be like, the National Endowment of something, and I'll be like, okay, let me look that up and see if they're still doing that program, and I'll add it to my list. So I'm always on the lookout for something, and I kind of just add it to this document that's been living for a while, and I revisit it when I want to apply for things and take notes. So you can find it anywhere. I mean, people have bios out there and CVs, so they're also like good resources for information that might not just be available.
Yeah, there's actually, let me give 1 second. This Heather Darcy Bhandari, who some of you know, wrote this book, Artwork, along with Jonathan Melber. Interviewed a lot of artists. There's a lot of great advice in it. But one of the things that I'd mentioned, I think is a quote in the book, is that when you go to any gallery website, very often the CVs are going to be posted, the artist resumes, and each one of them is a roadmap. It's a blueprint for where they got grants, where they got residencies, where else they've been shown. So not, again, to the point that Kristen made, that you're literally, my work is exactly like, but I'm already showing. But if your work is in alignment aesthetically or connected, then that can be a really good divining rod to lead you to other resources very quickly. If you go through a couple of these sites, you can amass them very fast. And to the point Anita made, keeping your own personal list and database, and some people are, have prompts even and get calendar reminders for deadlines, can be incredibly valuable. And everyone's organizational style is different. But on that note, and ending, the three of you have been just absolutely awesome and just fabulous with all this great insight. Thank you so much for being here tonight and giving of your time, to afford all of these great insights. And I really hope, as we get this out there further, that so many people will take advantage of the great conversation that we had this evening. So thank you again.